Now what I've done here is I've animated a sphere to move across the screen, and I want it to look like it's moving very, very quickly. You know when you take a photograph of something that's moving very quickly and you get the photograph back, that quick moving object is almost blurred. It's the same kind of effect in Maya. And what I've done is I've applied motion blur to it, and this is actually the result. So at frame 6, this is what the sphere looks like. So it helps kind of give that impression of a really fast moving object. So if we go to the render globals, just under the motion blur section, it's off by default. So you can turn it on, and we have two types of motion blur. One is 2D and one is 3D. 2D is for a very simplistic motion blur. It's for an object that's maybe moving across the screen, you know, from a sort of an X location, just right across the screen. Whereas the 3D motion blur is for something like much more complicated motion blur that's going to include a rotation or something. I would advise you to start off with 2D motion blur, see if you can get the results that you're looking for with this type of blur. If not, then go to the 3D motion blur. 3D is much more expensive than the 2D. Now with 2D we have lots of controls to make our motion blur larger, or how sharp it is, etc. But we also have a control on the camera. So I'm just going to go to the camera attribute editor, and just under special effects there's something called shutter angle. Now the shutter angle, basically what happens is the shutter angle is divided by 360 degrees, and you're going to get some kind of decimal value. So by default the shutter angle is 144. So if we divide that by 360, we get 0.4. Now what that 0.4 represents is the interval in time between something called shutter open and shutter close. So when we talk about motion blur, what happens is we sample the object at certain times. So one is shutter open, one is shutter mid, and one is shutter close. So let's say for instance we wanted a blur at frame 1. What we're going to do is we're going to go back a little bit from the frame, and that's going to be shutter open. Shutter mid is always at the frame, so we're going to sample the object at frame 1. And then shutter close is a little bit past the frame. Okay? So the shutter angle kind of determines where we're going to be sampling that object, like where in time. So we got a value of 0.4 here. So just in terms, again, if we were blurring at frame 1, we're going to take that 0.4, we're going to divide it in half, so we're going to get a 0.2 and another 0.2. And then that's going to be the interval behind the frame and in front of the frame that we're going to sample. So shutter open is going to be 0.8, shutter mid is going to be 1, and shutter close is going to be 1.2. So you can imagine if we start increasing this value, so for instance, if we made this 360 degrees, or 360, excuse me, if we divide that by 360, we're going to get a value of 1. We divide that in half, so we get a 0.5 and 0.5. So we're sampling, almost half a frame before the frame and a half a frame after the frame. So the higher the shutter angle, the more motion blur you're going to get. In Mental Ray for Maya, a number of post effects aren't supported. So things like paint effects, 2D motion blur, fur isn't supported, and also shader and light glow are not supported in Mental Ray for Maya. Let's look at the Mental Ray for Maya motion blur. So in this scene, what I've got is just a sphere. It's just moving across a plane. And you can see I'm ray tracing. And you can see a reflection in my plane. So let's go ahead and turn on motion blur. So if we just go under the Mental Ray tab here, under calculation, motion blur is off by default. Okay? And if we just go to the drop-down menu, you'll see that there's two types of motion blur we can use with Mental Ray for Maya. One is the linear type, and what that's going to do is take into account an object's transformation, rotation, and scale. So any deformation an object has won't be considered. So for instance, if you have a blend shape on a skeleton, that won't be considered in the blur. So what you need to do for that is choose the exact deformation, or excuse me, the exact type of motion blur. And what that's going to do is take in all transformations into account, including the deformations. Now this type is more expensive. The exact is more expensive than the linear type of motion blur. But let's choose linear for now, and let's turn the motion blur by up to 3. Okay, so what that's going to do is, again, it's going to give us a lot more blur. It's going to stretch out the blur, make it more noticeable. So I just wanted to point out that the shutter angle on the Maya camera that we looked at earlier does affect the length of motion blur in the mental ray for Maya motion blur. So it will increase or decrease the motion blur depending on whether or not you increase or decrease the degrees on that. So I'm just going to leave motion blur by at 3, doing a linear transformation. And the really neat thing about the motion blur in mental ray for Maya is it will allow you to actually motion blur reflections. So the Maya renderer is not capable of that, and the mental ray renderer is capable of that. So if we just keep this image and do a render, and then we'll just do a comparison of the two images. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this up full screen, 1:1. So you can see that we've got some blur here, blur in the reflection, and that's our original. Okay, so you can see the difference there. No blur, and nice blurred reflection. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the depth of field in mental ray for Maya. Now, mental ray for Maya uses a 3D depth of field. So it's a little bit more accurate than the Maya depth of field. And I've got a file for that. And you can set it up exactly the same way as you would with Maya. What I've got here is just 3 spheres. And what I'm going to do is focus on the middle sphere and hopefully have these 2 kind of spheres that are behind and in front of that other sphere just kind of become more blurred, okay, so we can get that kind of depth of field look. So I'm just going to go to the hypershade here. So I'm going to just change the panel and open up the connection editor. So excuse me, Windows General Editors Connection Editor. And exactly the same way that we set it up before, I'm going to get the perspective shape node of the camera and just plug it into the right and the left-hand column. And we're going to hook up the center of interest to the focus distance. So first thing that we should do actually is go back to that top view and set up our focus distance. So select the camera, camera light manipulator, go to the center of interest. Okay, and you can see it here in the perspective, and as I move this around, it's going to change. So we'll make that our center of interest. So basically when we hook up the center of interest to the focus distance, this is the area that's going to be in focus. So let's go back and try that again. So let's go back to the hypershade, panel, hypershade, and open up the connection editor again. And the connection is the center of interest, just right there, to the focus distance. Okay, and so I'll just need to make sure that that's turned on in the camera. So we're going to select the camera and just go to the attribute editor. And under depth of field, just turn that on. Okay, so now if we do a render, okay, you can see there's a little bit of blur. Okay, you can see that this is quite in focus here, and there's a little bit of blur on our 2 spheres back here. I'm going to increase that blur just by decreasing the f-stop, just so that we can see it a little bit better. Okay, so you can see now much better that this is still in focus, whereas we're getting a lot more blur on the spheres that are in front of and behind the focus distance.